Hello, and welcome to Reflections on Film. In this video, I'll be talking about Get Out, the 2017 film directed by Jordan Peele. Get Out tells the story of Chris, a photographer who travels with his girlfriend Rose to meet her family for the first time. Chris is African American, while Rose and her family are Caucasian. And over the course of the visit to the family's home, it becomes clear that something strange is going on, and Chris becomes increasingly paranoid about Rose's family and the African American employees working for them. Now, this film is a mashup of genres and tones, and connecting it all is a central theme of racial tension, the sort of universal struggle to accept and understand people that we think of as being different from ourselves. It's a movie that wants you to ask questions about race and confront the complexities of racial division. And after watching the film for the first time, there was one character that sort of stuck out in my mind, and that would be Jim Hudson, who we're introduced to about halfway through the film. And Jim is a blind art distributor, and a very successful one, despite not actually being able to see the pieces he distributes. Instead, he relies on detailed descriptions provided by an assistant. And we first meet Jim at a party where Chris is introduced to friends of Rose's family. Almost all of them Caucasian and seemingly wealthy, and all of them behaving sort of strangely. All of them except for Jim Hudson. Unlike all the other people Chris meets at this party, Jim doesn't seem uncomfortable. He doesn't change his behavior, but actually seems to be genuine. Jim's first words in the film announce what it is that separates him from the other people Chris has met.
Ignorance.
Who?
All of them.
They mean well, but they have no idea what real people go through.
The other people Chris meets seem to demonstrate behaviors consistent with feelings of racial anxiety. They seem to be uncomfortable because of Chris's race, and so they overcompensate to try and show that they're not overtly racist. They violate Chris's personal space, they ask him uncomfortable questions about his race, and they steer the conversation towards topics they'll assume he'll want to talk about based only on his race. And this is its own type of racially motivated behavior. Rather than simply treating Chris like any other person, they're uncomfortable because of his race, and therefore they treat him differently. They treat him not like an equal, but as an outsider, an other. But Jim is different. He's even visually presented to the audience in a different way than the other guests Chris has met. The other guests are each presented to us in a similar way. We see in wide shots, Chris and Rose are positioned in direct opposition to the people they're speaking with. In these shots, Chris and Rose fill one half of the frame. The party guests fill the other half, and the two groups are each facing opposite directions. And in the following close-ups and over-the-shoulder shots, which jump between these characters' perspectives, the two groups are always facing opposite directions. The blocking and the positioning of the camera in these scenes suggests that there's an invisible barrier between these characters. There's something separating them, preventing them from having an honest interaction. And when that barrier is broken, it feels like a violation. Now let's look at how Chris is introduced to Jim. Chris enters the scene from the same side of the shot that Jim is positioned in, crossing behind and eventually filling the right side of the frame, while Jim fills the left side. The blocking here still suggests a separation between the two characters, with each dominating one half of the screen. But I think it's interesting that Jim's hands actually rest directly in the center of the frame. But, unlike all the other people Chris has met, he and Jim are facing the same direction throughout this entire interaction. They're looking at the world with a sort of shared perspective. Even after Chris sits next to Jim and the camera angle changes, the two men are still facing the same direction in every shot. The blocking and camera work suggests that they're looking at the world from parallel points of view. It's also interesting that in this interaction, Chris is the person who breaks that invisible barrier separating the screen in half. Chris crosses that line and sits next to Jim, and the camera slowly pans down to show us the two men sitting together comfortably in the same half of the frame, still facing the same direction. So, what is it that sets Jim apart from the others? Why is he being presented in a different way than the other party guests? And I think that's revealed in the character's backstory. The other party guests are like Jim when he was unsuccessfully trying to be a photographer. Jim wanted to be an artist. He wanted to show the world that he can see and capture its beauty, but he didn't have the eye to really do it. He lacked the empathy to see beauty not just from his own limited perspective, but from a perspective that would resonate with others. Similarly, the other people Chris has met feel the need to demonstrate that they're not overtly racist, but can't see that by changing their behavior in reaction to Chris's race, they're still marginalizing him. They can't break through the racial barriers to see Chris as human, not just as an African American, displaying their own lack of empathy. They can't see the world through Chris's eyes. But Jim is different now. He no longer sees the world through his own flawed perspective. Instead, he must constantly rely on the perspectives of others, of outsiders, to formulate judgments. This is mirrored in his backstory, only finding success after losing his sight and being forced to rely on other people's descriptions to see works of art. Jim is different from the other characters because he relies totally on empathy to interact with the world. And it's only after being forced to rely on empathy that he finally gains, at least in some way, the ability to recognize beauty. Jim treats Chris like a human, not like an African American, because this reliance on empathy is hardwired into his brain. But what's most interesting to me is that this empathy doesn't mean that Jim Hudson is a good person. Even though he seems to have a better understanding of the real world and real people, by the end of the party scene, we see that Jim is just as involved in the mysterious plans going on behind the scenes as anyone else. I think it's interesting that Jim Hudson stuck out in my mind after seeing the film, and the analysis that followed really made me think about my own perspective of the world. I'd like to think that I treat all people equally, that I try not to rely on stereotypes or generalizations too much, and that's probably why this character stuck out to me, because I can relate to Jim. I won't ever really know what life is like for African Americans or anybody of any other race that I don't identify with, but I do my best to rely on empathy to guide my interactions with all people, and in that way try to develop a personal view of the world that relies on stereotypes as little as possible. But what Jim Hudson reveals is that developing strong empathetic skills doesn't free you from the moral obligation of fighting back against intolerance. By not speaking up and not taking action when confronted with discrimination of any kind, a person becomes just as guilty of perpetuating that ignorance as anyone else. Jim Hudson scares me because he can actually empathize with Chris near the end of the film when the secret plans are finally brought to light. He can actually understand the horror running through Chris's mind, but he doesn't care. Jim is a monster, and even though he knows that there's no separation between white and black, he's still willing to take advantage of the ignorance and bias of others for his own personal benefit. It scares me because I don't know how much like Jim I really am. And that's where I'll wrap up this discussion. If you have any thoughts about this video or the film Get Out, let me know in the comments section. Once again, this has been Reflections on Film, and as always, thanks for watching.